In today's episode, a 42-year-old mother takes her cattle out into the wilderness of southeast India to graze under the trees. Watching her cattle from a comfortable spot under a tree, she has no idea a mother sloth bear and her cub is hiding above her. Within a matter of minutes, the bear cub falls out of the tree directly under the woman's lap, initiating a fierce and deadly attack by the mother bear. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. This is the terrifying sloth bear attack on Sanjali Rathwa. Welcome to Final Affliction. Amblipani Kohotra is a village located in the Deod district in the southeast of India. It's one of those places that seems to have found a balance between the modern world and the old ways. Tribesmen in their traditional clothes walk the streets among the market stalls and cattle roaming free. Farmers still work and harvest from the land like their ancestors have done for thousands of years, and women stroll with baskets of produce balanced on their heads. The countryside is lush and wild, littered with jungle terrain, farmlands, and sanctuaries to keep the indigenous animals safe from poachers, as well as a convenient way for tourists to come and see them. Amblipani is nestled close to one of these sanctuaries, the Sloth Bear Reserve, set out to preserve the endangered Indian bear. The locals have all seen one of these magnificent animals at one point or another, and for the most part, the people stay as far away as possible from these animals. They are by nature aggressive animals, unlike their black and grizzly cousins who will avoid people unless protecting their young or scared. They prefer to be left to their own devices, something that the people of Deod are more than happy to give them. December in India is a quiet time in nature. This is usually when mothering animals retreat into the overgrowth to spend the last few months with their young before setting them off by themselves when spring arrives. Also, there is more food the farther away from people they move. And given that this is the dry time of the year, the animals only come out when food is at its scarcest. And that seems to be the case for a mother sloth bear and her cub. She'd had her pair of cubs 2 months ago, but the smaller of the two had already died. It was much weaker than its sibling, and the scarce winter foliage and the struggle of fighting its larger and stronger brother for milk had just been too much for the young cub. The female was incredibly protective of her only remaining offspring. She didn't much like going so close to the human settlements, but that's where the food led her to go, and she needed to feed herself and her cub if they were going to see the new growth in spring. On that day in 2021, the bear and her cub on her back were rooting for termites and bugs among the hollows of tree roots. That morning, Sanjali Rathwa was also looking for food, but not for herself. The 42-year-old needed to get her cattle out to graze as early as she could. Even in winter, India is still warm, albeit dry. Sanjali led the herd into the canopy of the trees before the sun could get high, and they could at least find some shade while her animals ate to their heart's content. Sanjali genuinely enjoyed the quiet and stillness of the wilderness, with only the sounds of birds and the crunch of hooves to break the silence. The first 3 hours went as expected, and Sanjali even found a spot to rest underneath a tree for a good hour before the herd started moving deeper into the bush. She sighed, but decided that there were plenty of other places to keep herself company with her own thoughts, wherever else the cows decided to graze, and set off after them. The sloth bear, with her cub still riding on her back, became acutely aware of the approaching herd of bovines. She yipped at her baby to keep him quiet and made her way up the nearest tree to safety. It was best to wait until the creatures passed before she got back on the ground. But to her already vexed agitation, the cows settled right around the tree she was hiding in. It was not a very high vantage point, barely 2 meters tall, and she didn't feel especially well hidden. Intermingled with the smell of herbivores, there was another scent, a human scent, that she didn't like at all. Humans were loud and dangerous. She avoided them at all costs, especially now that she had a young one to take care of. And to the bear's great unease, the human walking behind the herd started walking over to the very tree she was hidden in. Minutes dragged by, the woman below in the shade, completely unaware of the animals above her. The mother sloth bear and her cub were so camouflaged that they practically disappeared into the foliage above. The cub's long weight on its mother's back, with only her breathing to lull it into a stupor, slowly drifted off to sleep. Its claws relaxed, and before the mother could stop him, he went tumbling through the branches. The black cub, which resembled a small dog more than a bear, landed with a thump on Sanjali's crossed legs. She let out a startled yell when the flailing baby bear landed on her. Her shout set several things in motion all at once. A flock of birds shot into the air. Her herd of cows took off running in fright, and the mother bear above Sanjali's head let out a roar of panic and anger. She leapt off the branches just as the woman looked up at the sound from above and landed with her full 200-pound weight on top of Sanjali's head, claws already outstretched. Her nails dug into Sanjali's neck and cheeks, tearing and ripping at every inch of her that they could reach in a frenzied attack. The woman was crushed beneath the immense weight of the fully grown bear, and she could only try to grab hold of the thick and coarse fur in an attempt to get it off of her. But it was of no use. Sanjali, weighing only 120 pounds at most, was no match for the mother in full protection mode. The claws on her neck yanked away, tearing out a large chunk of muscle and skin. The arterial spray that evacuated the wound coated Sanjali, the bear, and the tree in bright red blood. The animal rolled off, got its feet under it again, and went after the screaming woman once more. Sanjali's hands went to her throat the moment the weight was off her, trying desperately to stem the torrent of blood. On her knees, she attempted to get up to run, but she'd lost so much blood so quickly that her knees promptly gave in on her. And then the creature was on top of her again, her jaws closing over Sanjali's whole face. Her teeth sank into Sanjali's skull and under her jaw. The animal shook Sanjali like she weighed nothing, and Sanjali was already too weakened from her injuries to pose any resistance. Her limbs flayed with the force, and her body was limp. The bear shook her a second time and realized that the human had stopped moving. She released Sanjali's head, and the woman lay lifelessly on the ground. A sniff was enough to assure the mother bear that the human was no longer a threat. So she left Sanjali there to bleed to death under the tree and to find her cub, which had stayed hidden behind a large boulder nearby. She decided it was safer to live off less food in the deep jungle after all, and the pair trotted into the foliage, never to be seen again. The day wore on, with no one in the village having any idea of the horrendous tragedy that had occurred to their neighbor. It was only when the small herd of cattle, driven by schedule and the knowledge of where their shelter was, came walking back into town, that the people realized that something was very, very wrong indeed. Their handler was not with the cows, and they set out to look for her, hoping that she'd taken a fall or maybe fainted in the heat of the day. But by nightfall, after not finding any trace of Sanjali, the authorities were called in to assist in the search. While the village took care of her worried children, the night dragged on. It wasn't until the next morning that Sanjali's remains were finally found. She'd been almost completely scalped from her jaw to the base of her neck, and what was left of her neck was nothing but a raw, shredded open wound. Authorities could at least determine what had attacked her, and that her death had been relatively quick. The sloth bear's first clawing had severed the jugular and main arteries. Sanjali had lost consciousness before the rest of her scalping had occurred in the second wave of the attack. There was a funeral paid for by the state and attended by everyone in the village, old and young. The only sloth bear attack of 2021 in India was a fatality, and the victim was a mother, a sister, and a beloved resident of her community, who unfortunately met her terrifying final affliction.